The fog rolled thick over Chicago's Loop District that morning, a gray shroud that clung to the skyscrapers and muted the usual roar of the city. Emily Harper pulled her trench coat tighter around her as she hurried down Wacker Drive, her boots clicking against the damp pavement. It was March 8th, 2025, International Women's Day, a date that always buzzed with corporate emails about empowerment and appreciation. But for Emily, it was just another day to survive. 3 years as James Carver's executive assistant at Carver Enterprises had taught her that holidays didn't mean downtime. Not when you worked for a man who could shift the tech world with a single phone call. Her breath puffed out in little clouds as she approached the sleek glass tower, its 40 stories piercing the mist like a blade. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and steel, all sharp angles and hushed voices, and Emily flashed her badge at the security desk before stepping into the elevator. The ride to the 32nd floor was silent except for the hum of the machinery, giving her a moment to steady herself. She was good at her job, damn good, and James knew it. That's why she'd lasted when others hadn't. But there was always a cost: the late nights, the endless emails, the way his presence seemed to fill every room she walked into. The doors slid open, and she stepped into the executive suite, a sprawling space of glass walls and minimalist design. Her desk sat just outside James's corner office, a perch that gave her a front-row seat to his world. She dropped her bag, hung her coat, and froze. There, on the edge of her desk, was a small bouquet of white lilies, their petals stark against the dark wood. Nestled among them was a folded note. Her fingers hesitated before picking it up, unfolding it to reveal sharp, deliberate handwriting. Emily, success isn't just numbers, it's people. Thank you. J.C. Her pulse kicked up a notch. James Carver didn't do gestures like this. He was all precision and power, boardroom deals and late-night strategy sessions, not flowers and handwritten notes. She traced the letters with her fingertip, feeling the faint indent of the pen, and a flicker of unease stirred in her chest. What was this? A reward? A trap? She'd seen him fire people with less warning than this. Emily. His voice cut through the silence, low and smooth, pulling her out of her thoughts. She turned to see him standing in the doorway of his office, one hand braced against the frame. James Carver was 38, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair just starting to gray at the temples. His gray eyes locked on hers, sharp and unreadable, and his tailored suit hugged him like it was made for a king, which, in a way, he was. The sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, a rare crack in his polished armor, and the top button of his shirt was undone, revealing a sliver of tanned skin. "Morning," she said, keeping her tone steady despite the way her stomach flipped. "Thanks for the flowers. They're unexpected." He didn't smile, but something shifted in his expression. Amusement, maybe, or something darker. "Come in. I need a word." She nodded, tucking the note into her pocket as she followed him into his office. The space was a fortress of power, a massive mahogany desk, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the foggy skyline, and walls lined with photos of him shaking hands with CEOs and senators. He didn't sit, just leaned against the desk, arms crossed, watching her with that intensity that always made her feel like he could see straight through her. "Nice gesture," she said, nodding at the lilies still visible on her desk through the glass. "Didn't peg you for the sentimental type." "I'm not," he replied, his voice like velvet over steel. "But today's different. I've made a decision, Emily, one that involves you." Her brows knitted together. "What kind of decision?" He didn't answer right away, letting the silence stretch until it pressed against her ribs. Then he straightened, his height casting a shadow over her. "I'm shutting the office down early today. Everyone's out by noon." He paused, his gaze pinning her in place. "Except you. I need you to stay." Her mouth went dry. "Why?" "Because," he said, stepping closer, close enough that she caught the faint scent of cedar and spice on him. "There's something we need to settle. Just you and me." Before she could respond, he grabbed his jacket from the chair and headed for the door, pausing only to glance back. "Lock up after I leave. I'll be back." And then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving Emily standing in the middle of his office with her heart pounding and a dozen questions she didn't dare ask. She crossed to the window, staring out at the fog-choked city below, and pressed the note in her pocket between her fingers. Whatever James Carver was playing at, it wasn't just about work anymore. And deep down, she knew she was already in too deep to walk away. Emily stood frozen in James's office, the echo of his footsteps fading down the hall. The lilies on her desk stared back at her through the glass wall, their white petals mocking her with their innocence. She pulled the note from her pocket again, rereading it. "Success isn't just numbers, it's people. Thank you." The words felt heavier now, laced with something she couldn't name. She crumpled the paper and tossed it onto the desk, her fingers trembling slightly. Whatever James wanted, it wasn't a simple thank you. The clock on the wall ticked toward noon, and she watched from the window as employees trickled out of the building, their figures swallowed by the fog. The suite grew eerily quiet, the hum of the HVAC the only sound left. She crossed to the door, her hand hesitating over the lock. He'd said to secure it. Why? Her gut twisted, but she turned the bolt anyway, the metallic click reverberating through the empty space like a gunshot. She sank into the leather chair behind his desk, the scent of polished wood and his cologne wrapping around her. This wasn't her place. She was the assistant, not the CEO, but sitting there felt like stepping into his skin, dangerous and thrilling all at once. Her eyes drifted to his laptop, still open on the desk. The screen glowed faintly, an email thread pulled up. She shouldn't look. She knew she shouldn't. But the subject line caught her. Board vote. Carver's exit. Her breath hitched. She leaned closer, scanning the text. The board's closing in. Evidence from the old deals resurfaced. Move fast, or you're out by Monday. The sender was anonymous, the timestamp from last night. Her mind raced. James, forced out? He'd built Carver Enterprises from a startup into a tech empire. The board wouldn't dare. Unless they had something concrete. Something bad. The sound of the outer door rattling snapped her upright. She slammed the laptop shut just as James stepped back into the suite, his silhouette filling the doorway. He locked it behind him with a slow, deliberate turn, his eyes finding hers through the glass. Her pulse thudded in her ears as he crossed to the office, his jacket slung over one shoulder, shirt collar open wider now. He didn't knock, just pushed the door open and stepped inside, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him. "You locked it," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Good." She stood, smoothing her skirt to hide the shake in her hands. "You told me to." "What's going on, James?" He didn't answer right away, just studied her with that piercing gray stare that always made her feel exposed. Then he dropped his jacket over the chair and leaned against the desk, inches from where she stood. "You've been with me 3 years, Emily. You've seen the chaos, the wins, the late nights. You've never flinched." She swallowed, her throat dry. "It's my job. It's more than that." His tone sharpened, and he stepped closer, his cedar and spice scent flooding her senses. "I've watched you. You're not just good, you're the best. And right now, I need the best." Her stomach flipped. "For what?" He hesitated, then reached past her to unlock a drawer in the desk. His arm brushed hers, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt through her. He pulled out a thin folder, tossing it onto the wood between them. "The board's coming for me. They've dug up an old deal, something I buried years ago. If they get their hands on the full story, I'm done." She stared at the folder, her mind spinning back to the email. What kind of deal? Doesn't matter yet. He waved it off, but his jaw tightened, a crack in his calm. What matters is there's evidence in this building. Proof I didn't screw anyone over. I need you to help me find it. Tonight. "Why me?" she pressed, stepping into his space instead of away. "You've got lawyers, security, a whole damn team. Why your assistant?" His eyes darkened, and for a moment, she thought he'd deflect again. But then he leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Because you're the only one I trust. And because, he stopped, his gaze flicking to her lips, then back up. Because I've seen you, Emily. Really seen you. Beyond the schedules and the coffee runs. And I can't do this without you. Her heart slammed against her ribs. This wasn't just about work anymore. She felt it in the air between them, thick and electric. She should have stepped back, set a boundary, but her feet stayed rooted. You're asking a lot, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. What's in it for me? A ghost of a smile tugged at his mouth, not smug, but knowing. Stay, and you'll find out. He straightened, breaking the moment, and nodded at the filing cabinets along the wall. Start there. Contracts from 2018. Look for anything tied to Project Eclipse. She exhaled, the tension coiling tighter in her chest, and moved to the cabinets. He followed, his presence a shadow at her back as they began pulling files. Their shoulders brushed as she handed him a stack, and his fingers lingered over hers, warm and firm. She froze, her breath catching, but he didn't pull away, just met her eyes with a look that said he'd felt it too. James, she started, her voice barely above a whisper. What are we doing here? He didn't answer, just held her gaze, the weight of his silence louder than words. Then he turned back to the files, leaving her standing there with her pulse racing and a sinking feeling that whatever they found tonight, it wouldn't just save his company, it might ruin her. The air in James's office thickened as Emily rifled through the filing cabinet, the rustle of paper the only sound breaking the silence. Her fingers skimmed over faded labels, 2018, Project Eclipse, while James worked the shelf beside her, his movements sharp and controlled. Every brush of his arm against hers sent a spark up her spine, and she hated how aware she was of him. The flex of his forearms as he flipped through folders, the faint catch in his breath when their eyes met. She should have been focused on the task, finding whatever evidence he needed, but her mind kept snagging on the way he'd said her name, low and urgent, like it meant more than it should. Anything? He asked, his voice cutting through her haze. She shook her head, pulling out a thin folder marked Eclipse, Phase 2. Maybe this. She handed it to him, their fingers grazing again. This time, he didn't let go right away. His thumb pressed lightly against her knuckles, a deliberate linger that made her pulse jump. She yanked her hand back, clutching the next file to steady herself, and caught a flicker of something in his eyes, amusement, or maybe hunger. He opened the folder, scanning it, then froze. A photo slipped out, fluttering to the floor between them. Emily bent to pick it up, her breath catching as she saw it. James, younger, standing beside a woman with sharp cheekbones and dark hair. Her face was scratched out, a jagged line of ink obliterating her features. Who's this? She demanded, holding it up. His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath the stubble. No one important. Bullshit. She stepped closer, the photo trembling slightly in her grip. You're hiding something, James. If I'm risking my neck for you, I deserve to know what's going on. He snatched the photo from her, his fingers brushing hers with enough force to make her flinch. You don't need to know everything, he snapped, but his voice cracked at the end, betraying him. He turned away, shoving the picture back into the folder, but Emily wasn't letting it go. Tell me, she said, grabbing his arm. His bicep tensed under her hand, warm and solid, and he spun to face her, his gray eyes stormy. They were close now. Too close, his chest rising and falling just inches from hers. Her name was Lauren, he said finally, the words rough like they'd been dragged out of him. She was my partner, business, and more. We built Eclipse together, a software rollout that was supposed to change everything. But I cut corners, pushed it too fast. When it crashed, she took the fall. I let her. Emily's grip loosened, but she didn't step back. What happened to her? She disappeared. Left the country, or worse, I don't know. The board's got proof I shifted the blame, and they're using it to bury me. His voice dropped, raw and unguarded. I've carried that guilt every day since. But I can't lose this company, Emily. And I can't. He stopped, his gaze locking on hers, intense and searching. I can't lose you. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Me? I'm just your assistant. No, you're not. He stepped closer, erasing the space between them. His hand hovered near her arm, then settled there, his fingers tracing a slow line up her sleeve. The touch was light, but it burned through her, sending a shiver racing down her spine. You're the only one who's ever seen me. The real me, not the CEO bullshit. I've fought this for months, Emily. Watching you, wanting you, telling myself it was wrong. She should have pulled away, should have said no, walked out, saved herself. But her body wouldn't listen. Her breath quickened, her skin prickling where his fingers lingered. Why now? She whispered, her voice barely holding. Because I'm done fighting it. His hand slid to her shoulder, then higher, cupping the back of her neck. His thumb brushed the edge of her jaw, and she felt the tremor in his touch, the crack in his control. I need you to know, before everything falls apart. Her mind screamed to stop, but her body leaned into him, drawn by the heat of his closeness. Know what? This. He tilted her face up, his thumb grazing her lower lip, and then he kissed her. It was slow at first, tentative, like he was testing the edge of a cliff. His lips were warm, firm, tasting faintly of coffee and something darker, and she froze for half a heartbeat before melting into it. Her hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer as the kiss deepened, hungry and desperate. He groaned low in his throat, his fingers tightening in her hair, and she felt the press of his chest against hers, solid and unyielding. Her back hit the filing cabinet, the metal cool through her blouse, and he followed, one hand braced beside her head. The world narrowed to the heat of his mouth, the scrape of his stubble against her skin, the way his breath hitched when she arched into him. It wasn't soft or gentle. It was raw, a collision of everything they'd held back, and it lit her up like a live wire. When they broke apart, gasping, his forehead rested against hers, his eyes dark and wild. Emily, he murmured, his voice wrecked. I've wanted that too damn long. She stared at him, her lips tingling, her hands still tangled in his shirt. So have I, she admitted, the truth spilling out before she could stop it. His grip tightened, possessive now, and he kissed her again, harder, deeper, like he was claiming her. She matched him, her fingers digging into his shoulders, the tension between them snapping like a frayed cord. The photo lay forgotten on the floor, the boards thread a distant hum. In that moment, it was just them, two people who'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross, and neither of them cared. Emily's breath came in shallow bursts as she pulled back from James, her hands still pressed against his chest. His shirt was wrinkled where she'd gripped it, and his gray eyes burned into hers, dark and unguarded. The filing cabinet pressed into her spine, a cold anchor in the heat swirling between them. The photo of Lauren lay crumpled on the floor, its scratched-out face a silent witness to the line they'd just obliterated. Her lips still tingled from his kiss, her pulse a wild drumbeat she couldn't quiet. James didn't move away. His hand stayed tangled in her hair, his thumb brushing the nape of her neck in a slow, possessive sweep. You okay? He asked, his voice rough, like he'd run out of air too. She nodded, not trusting her words yet. Her fingers flexed against his chest, feeling the steady thump of his heart beneath the fabric, a rhythm that mirrored her own chaos. We shouldn't have, she started, but the lie stuck in her throat. She wanted this, had wanted it longer than she'd let herself admit. Don't. He cut in, his tone firm but soft. Don't say that. He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm on her cheek. There's no going back now, Emily. Not after that. She swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. The office felt smaller, the air charged with something heavier than lust, something dangerous. She pulled her hands away, stepping to the side to put space between them, but the heat of his touch lingered on her skin. "What happens now?" she asked, turning to face him. "The board, the evidence. What's the plan?" He straightened, running a hand through his hair, the silver strands catching the dim light. "We find it. Tonight. Prove I didn't tank Lauren on purpose. If we don't, they'll vote me out by Monday, and everything I've built." He stopped, his gaze locking on hers. "Everything we've built goes down with me." She crossed her arms, steadying herself. "And us? What's this mean for us?" A shadow crossed his face, but then he stepped toward her, closing the gap again. His hand found her cheek, warm and sure, tilting her face up to meet his eyes. "It means you're mine now," he said, his voice low and certain, a promise wrapped in a threat. "Not just here, not just tonight. You're in this with me, all of it." Her stomach flipped, a thrill chasing the unease. She should have pushed back, set boundaries, but the way he looked at her, like she was the only thing keeping him tethered, made her nod instead. "Okay," she whispered, the words sealing something she couldn't take back. He smiled, faint but real, and brushed his thumb across her lip one last time before stepping away. He bent to pick up the photo, tucking it into the folder with a finality that felt like burying a ghost. "Let's finish this," he said, nodding at the files. "Then we figure out the rest." Emily watched him, the city's foggy glow seeping through the windows behind him. The board, Lauren, the evidence, it all loomed like a storm on the horizon. But right now, it was just them, standing on the edge of something neither could control. She'd saved him tonight. Maybe, or maybe she'd just stepped into his trap. Either way, she wasn't walking away, not yet. The Chicago skyline glittered outside, indifferent to the shift that had just happened in this quiet office. Emily took a deep breath, the scent of cedar and paper grounding her, and turned back to the files. Whatever came next, she was in it now, heart, soul, and all. "Hey, thanks for sticking with Shadows of Power all the way to the end. What do you think? Did Emily just save James, or did she fall into something she can't escape?" Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm dying to hear your take. And if you love this ride, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you don't miss the next story. More twists, more heat, coming your way soon.